Millionaire sees three poor genius boys teaching his nonverbal disabled daughter to speak, and changes their lives. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see. Now, on to the story. Richard Coleman stood motionless at the window of his Beacon Hill mansion, watching as yet another specialist exited his daughter's room with the same defeated expression. The Boston skyline glittered against the evening sky, a stark contrast to the heavy darkness that had settled in his heart. "Mr. Coleman." The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm afraid we're still unable to determine what's causing Olivia's regression." Richard's fingers tightened around the medical report until the expensive paper crumpled beneath his grip. His daughter, his 7-year-old miracle, had stopped responding to any stimuli 3 weeks ago. No eye contact, no interaction, nothing, but a haunting blankness in eyes that once sparkled with quiet intelligence. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. At 48, Richard had built a technology empire from nothing. He wasn't accustomed to problems he couldn't solve with money or influence. "I've flown in specialists from across the globe. Someone must have an answer." The neurologist shifted, uncomfortably. "Mr. Coleman, Olivia's condition was already complex. This sudden regression is puzzling, but sometimes with rare neurological disorders, I don't pay you for sometimes, doctor." Richard cut him off, turning to face the man. Fully. "I pay you for solutions." After the doctor left, Richard entered Olivia's room. The space looked more like a hospital suite than a little girl's bedroom. Medical equipment humming softly, monitors tracking vital signs, a rotation of nurses maintaining a constant vigil. In the center of it all, Olivia sat propped against pillows, her golden hair carefully brushed, wearing her favorite blue dress. Her eyes stared vacantly at nothing. "Sweetheart," Richard whispered, taking her small hand in his. "Daddy's here." No response, not even a flicker of recognition. His mind drifted back to that day in Boston Common 2 weeks earlier. He'd been watching Olivia from a distance as she sat with her caretaker on a park bench. He often did this, observing his daughter in moments when she didn't know he was there, hoping to catch glimpses of joy or progress. That's when he'd seen them approach. 3 ragged boys. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9, with the determined stance of someone accustomed to protecting the younger ones. The middle boy carried a tattered backpack, while the smallest, maybe 5 years old, clutched a worn toy. Richard had watched, initially frozen with concern, as they approached Olivia while her caretaker was distracted by her phone. But instead of the harassment he'd feared, something miraculous happened. The oldest boy had made silly faces that drew the ghost of a smile from Olivia. The middle one pulled homemade cards from his backpack, and the little one had gently taken Olivia's hand. For a moment, a precious, fleeting moment, his daughter had opened her mouth, attempting to mimic the sounds the smallest boy was making. The memory twisted like a knife in his chest. Because, what had he done? He'd rushed forward, roughly shoving the children away, firing the caretaker on the spot, and dragging Olivia home, away from the first real connection she'd made in months. An elderly woman had hurried toward them, defending. The boys, her grandsons apparently, but Richard had dismissed her with the same contempt he reserved for anyone he deemed beneath his notice. Now, as the machines beeped steadily in the quiet room, Richard Coleman faced the terrifying possibility that in his desperate attempt to protect his daughter, he might have destroyed her only chance at breaking through her silence. "I'm sorry, Olivia," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "Daddy made a terrible mistake." 2 weeks earlier, Richard stood concealed behind a massive oak tree in Boston Common, watching his daughter from afar. This had become his routine, observing Olivia when she thought no one was looking, hoping to witness some breakthrough in her silent world. Olivia sat on a bench while her caretaker, Jessica, scrolled through her phone. Richard frowned. He paid the woman handsomely to give his daughter her undivided attention. His irritation turned to alarm when he spotted 3 disheveled boys approaching. The oldest, skinny with determined eyes, looked about 9. The middle one, around 7, clutched a tattered backpack. The smallest couldn't be more than 5, with oversized clothes and a mop of unruly hair. Richard tensed, ready to intervene. But what happened next froze him in place. The oldest boy, Tyler, began making elaborate, silly faces. Richard watched in disbelief as Olivia's lips twitched upward in the ghost of a smile. The middle boy, Lucas, knelt before her, pulling handmade cards from his backpack. Each card had simple drawings paired with words. Happy, sad, hello. I made these myself, Lucas explained proudly. For my brother Mason when he couldn't talk good. The youngest boy, Mason, approached Olivia cautiously. With a gentleness that seemed beyond his years, he took her hand in his tiny fingers. Like this, he whispered, making soft sounds that seemed part of a private language. Miracle of miracles. Olivia opened her mouth, attempting to mimic the sounds Mason made. Something inside Richard snapped. He burst from his hiding spot, rushing toward the children. Get away from her, he shouted, roughly pushing Tyler back. Jessica, you're fired. Pack your things immediately. As he gripped Olivia's arm to pull her away, an elderly woman hurried toward them, her face flushed with indignation. What do you think you're doing? She demanded. Those are my grandsons. Your grandsons should be in school, not harassing vulnerable children, Richard spat. Keep them away from my daughter. The woman, Martha, stood her ground. They were only being kind, something you might learn from. I don't need parenting advice from someone who lets children run wild, Richard retorted, his voice dripping with disdain. Come, Olivia. We're leaving. As he pulled Olivia away, he failed to notice her looking back over her shoulder, her eyes following the 3 boys with longing. For the first time in months, something had awakened in her, a connection, and he had severed it instantly. Martha watched them go, her weathered face sad but resolute. Come, boys, she said softly. Some people can't see past appearances. Tyler took his brother's hands. But the girl who can't talk was happy with us, Grandma. I know, child, Martha sighed. I know. Neither Richard nor Martha realized then how profoundly their lives would soon become intertwined, or how those 3 little boys would change everything for the lonely millionaire and his silent daughter. The days following the park incident became increasingly torturous for Richard. Each morning he'd enter Olivia's room with forced optimism, only to be met with the same vacant stare. She refused to eat, avoided eye contact, and seemed to have retreated completely into her inner world. Mr. Coleman, Dr. Sarah Reynolds spoke, carefully, her experienced eyes studying Olivia as the child sat motionless on her bed. Has anything traumatic happened recently? Any changes to her routine or environment? Richard waved away the question. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual appointments and therapies. He conveniently omitted the park incident. Something about it made him uncomfortable. Perhaps the memory of his own behavior or the undeniable fact that Olivia had responded to those children in a way she hadn't with the expensive specialists he hired. I'll increase her therapy schedule, Richard declared, pulling out his phone. And I've ordered that new neural response equipment from Switzerland. It'll be here by Wednesday. Dr. Reynolds sighed. Mr. Coleman, more isn't always better. Olivia needs consistency and emotional connection, not just medical interventions. With all due respect, doctor, I believe in solutions. Real, tangible solutions, not feel-good theories. His tone left no room for debate. After the doctor left, Richard retreated to his home office, surrounding himself with medical journals and research papers. He made calls to specialists across the globe, offering obscene amounts of money for consultations. His company executives were instructed to handle operations without him. Olivia was his only priority now. Walter, his longtime chauffeur, observed this frenzy with growing concern. Having served the Coleman family for over 20 years, he'd witnessed Richard's transformation from an ambitious young entrepreneur to the cold, calculating businessman he'd become. But beneath that hardened exterior, Walter glimpsed something else. The desperate love of a father who didn't know how to reach his child. Late one evening, Walter was delivering fresh coffee to Richard's office when he found his employer staring blankly at the wall, medical reports scattered across his desk. "Nothing's working," Richard whispered, more to himself than to Walter. "I've hired the best minds in medicine. I've thrown millions at this problem. Why can't I fix her?" Walter hesitated, then carefully set down the coffee cup. "Perhaps, sir. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. But understood." Richard looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just that. Perhaps Miss Olivia needs something different than what medicine can provide." For a brief moment, Richard's carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the terrified father beneath. "What if I lose her, Walter? What if she never comes back to me?" Walter nodded solemnly, understanding the unspoken fear. "Sometimes, sir, the answers come from unexpected places." Neither spoke the obvious truth hanging in the air, that Richard Coleman, for all his wealth and power, might be completely helpless to save the one person who mattered most to him. Walter stood outside Richard's office door, hand poised to knock, his weathered face reflecting inner conflict. After 20 years of service, he knew his place, and offering unsolicited advice to Richard Coleman was certainly stepping beyond it. But the image of little Olivia, wasting away in her room, compelled him forward. 3 gentle knocks. "Enter," came Richard's tired voice. Walter found his employer hunched over his laptop, surrounded by medical reports and empty coffee cups. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his normally immaculate appearance now disheveled. "Sir, I've brought your evening meal," Walter said, setting down the tray. Then, gathering his courage, "If I might have a word?" Richard glanced up impatiently. "What is it?" "It's about Miss Olivia, sir." Walter cleared his throat. "I was thinking about what happened at the park." Richard stiffened. "What about it?" "Those children, sir. I've never seen Miss Olivia respond to anyone the way she did to them." "Perhaps." Walter hesitated, then pushed forward. "Perhaps they could help." Richard's laugh was hollow. "Bring street children into my home. Are you mad, Walter?" "They weren't. Just any children, sir. They connected with her somehow. The little one especially." "Nuff!" Richard slammed his hand on the desk. "I've consulted with the top neurologists in the world. I don't need advice from my driver about bringing vagrant children into my daughter's life." Walter nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir. Forgive the intrusion." As the door closed behind Walter, Richard buried his face in his hands. The suggestion was absurd, irrational beneath consideration. And yet, that night, Richard sat beside Olivia's bed, holding her limp hand, desperately searching for any sign of awareness in her vacant eyes. "Sweetheart, please," he whispered. "Come back to me." No response, not even a flicker. Against his will, Richard's mind returned to the park scene, to the moment when Olivia had opened her mouth, attempting to mimic the sounds the small boy had made. For a brief, shining instant, she had connected with the world, with 3 ragged children who had accomplished in minutes what teams of specialists had failed to do in years. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of his pride battling with his desperation. What was more important, his reputation or his daughter's well-being? Dawn found him still sitting by Olivia's bedside, having made the hardest decision of his life. When Walter arrived with breakfast, Richard didn't look up. "Find them," he said quietly. "Sir?" "The children from the park, their grandmother. Find them and bring them here." Richard finally turned, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Whatever it takes." Walter couldn't conceal his surprise or his relief. "Yes, sir, right away." As Walter hurried out, Richard looked back at his daughter. "I hope I'm not making another terrible mistake," he whispered. "But I'd do anything for you, Olivia. Anything at all." Walter spent the next 3 days methodically combing Boston for any sign of the 3 boys and their grandmother. He began, at Boston Common, questioning vendors and regular visitors before expanding his search to nearby neighborhoods. He visited homeless shelters, community centers, and soup kitchens throughout South End, showing a photo of Olivia and describing the children who had approached her. Most leads went nowhere, but Walter persisted with quiet determination. On the third day, exhausted and discouraged, he entered a small community center in South End. The building was worn but well-maintained, with children's artwork decorating, the walls and the smell of a communal meal lingering in the air. "I'm looking for an elderly woman," Walter explained to the coordinator. "She has 3 grandsons, ages approximately 5, 7, and 9. The coordinator's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why are you looking for them?" "My employer's daughter. She's very ill. These children somehow connected with her, and we believe they might help her." "Would your employer happen to be Richard Coleman?" When Walter nodded, the coordinator's expression hardened. "Martha told me what happened. That man humiliated those boys in public." "Please," Walter said softly. "The little girl is getting worse. She won't eat, won't respond to anyone. Mr. Coleman is desperate." Before the coordinator could answer, a voice spoke from behind them. "So the mighty Richard Coleman needs our help now?" Walter turned to find an elderly woman watching him with sharp, intelligent eyes. Despite her worn clothing, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Mrs. Martha," Walter said, recognizing her from the park. "Yes. Mr. Coleman sent me to find you and your grandsons." Martha crossed her arms. "First, he treats us like garbage, now he wants our help. The nerve of that man." "It's not for him," Walter replied. "It's for his daughter. She's very ill." A small head peeked around Martha's skirts. It was the oldest boy, Tyler. "Is the girl who can't talk sick?" he asked, his young face serious. "Yes," Walter confirmed. "She's gotten much worse since that day, in the park." Tyler looked up at his grandmother. "We should help her, Grandma. I can teach her to talk like I taught Mason." Martha's expression softened as she looked down at her grandson. Then she turned back to Walter, her resolve weakening. "That man treated us like we were nothing," she said, but the fire had gone from her voice. "I know," Walter acknowledged, "and I can't defend his behavior, but I've known Mr. Coleman for 20 years. He loves his daughter more than anything in this world. He's a desperate father, nothing more." Martha sighed deeply, studying Walter's face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "Boys," she called. 2 more small figures appeared, Lucas with his backpack and little Mason clutching a worn teddy bear. "We're going to visit the girl from the park. She's not feeling well." Tyler nodded solemnly. "I'll bring my special sounds book." As Walter led them to the waiting car, Martha caught his arm. "I'm doing this for the child," she said firmly, "not for him." "I understand," Walter replied, opening the car door. "And so does Mr. Coleman." The arrival of Martha and her grandsons at the Coleman mansion created a palpable tension. Richard stood in the grand foyer, his posture stiff and uncomfortable as Walter escorted the visitors inside. The contrast was stark. The opulent surroundings against Martha's worn but dignified appearance and the boys' clean but clearly second-hand clothing. "Mrs. Martha," Richard nodded formally, unable to meet her eyes directly. "Thank you for coming." Martha's response was cool but civil. "We're here for the child, Mr. Coleman." Tyler looked around with undisguised curiosity, while Lucas clutched his backpack tightly. Little Mason simply held his grandmother's hand, eyes wide at the splendor surrounding them. "This way," Richard said, leading them upstairs. The hallway to Olivia's room felt endless. Richard paused outside her door, his hand on the knob. For a moment, vulnerability cracked his composed facade. "She hasn't responded to anyone in weeks," he warned quietly. "Please don't be disappointed if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Martha's expression softened slightly at this glimpse of the worried father beneath the arrogant businessman. Inside, Olivia lay against her pillows, her face turned toward the window. A nurse was attempting to coax her to eat without success. "Olivia," Richard called softly. "There are some friends here to see you." No response. The nurse shook her head sadly and placed the untouched food aside. Tyler stepped forward confidently, seemingly unfazed by the medical equipment surrounding the bed. "Hi again," he said brightly. "Remember us from the park?" Nothing. Richard's heart sank. Lucas approached next, opening his backpack and arranging his homemade communication cards on the bed. "I brought my special cards," he explained, spreading them out. "See? This one means happy." Still no reaction from Olivia. Then Mason, the smallest, moved to the bedside. Without hesitation or instruction, he simply took Olivia's limp hand in his own tiny one. "Hi," he whispered, his voice soft but clear. "I'm Mason." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Richard was about to suggest they try again another day, when he noticed it, the slightest movement of Olivia's head turning away from the window, toward Mason. Tyler immediately moved closer, making the simple sounds he'd created for his younger brother years ago. "Ah, hey, oh," he demonstrated, exaggerating the mouth movements. To everyone's astonishment, Olivia's eyes tracked his movements. When Mason offered a spoonful of the abandoned food, she accepted it without resistance. "Try again," Tyler encouraged, making another sound. Olivia's lips parted slightly and a faint noise emerged, her first voluntary sound in weeks. "Ta," she managed, a clear attempt to say Tyler. Richard staggered backward, gripping the doorframe for support. The nurse gasped. Martha watched with quiet satisfaction. "She likes us," Mason stated simply, continuing to hold Olivia's hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Richard struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. In mere minutes, 3 children without medical training or expensive equipment had reached his daughter in ways that teams of specialists had failed to do for weeks. In that moment, watching his daughter's eyes show recognition for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Richard Coleman realized how desperately wrong he had been, and how much he still had to learn. Over the next few days, a remarkable transformation took place in the Coleman mansion. Richard formally proposed that Martha and the boys visit daily, offering his driver to transport them and suggesting a generous compensation for their time. "I don't want your money," Martha replied firmly, "but I won't deny the children the chance to help that little girl." A new routine quickly established itself. The rigid medical schedule that had dominated Olivia's life gradually gave way to interactive sessions with Tyler, Lucas, and Mason. The sterile atmosphere of her room softened as children's laughter and whispered conversations replaced the clinical silence. Tyler, with his extraordinary intuition for nonverbal communication, developed a personalized system for Olivia. His methods were unconventional but effective, combining sounds, gestures, and facial expressions that somehow made perfect sense to the little girl. "You have to feel the sounds," he explained to a baffled speech therapist who observed their session. "That's how I taught Mason when he was little." Lucas, methodical and detail-oriented, created simple games and tools from household materials, communication boards, picture cards, and tactile objects that engaged Olivia's senses. His inventiveness impressed even Richard, who found himself taking notes on the boy's intuitive approaches. "Look, Mr. Coleman," Lucas demonstrated proudly. "I made this board so she can point to what she wants. See? It has pictures of everything in her room." But it was Mason, the youngest, who formed the deepest bond with Olivia. The two would sit for hours, holding hands, exchanging glances that seemed to contain entire conversations. Mason's gentle presence had a calming effect that no medication had ever achieved. "They have their own language," Martha observed, watching the 2 children interact. "Sometimes words just get in the way." Richard observed these sessions from a distance at first, both fascinated and humbled by the natural ease with which the children connected with his daughter. The expensive specialists he'd hired stood on the sidelines, taking notes on methods they couldn't have conceived. Gradually, Richard began to participate, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. He learned Tyler's sound system, practiced Lucas's games, and sat quietly with Mason and Olivia, trying to understand their silent communication. The mansion itself seemed to breathe again. Doors that had remained closed for years were opened, rooms that had been preserved like museums, were now filled with the sound of children's footsteps. The kitchen staff, delighted by the change, prepared special treats for the afternoon sessions. Martha moved through this new environment with quiet dignity, maintaining a respectful distance from Richard while skillfully directing the children's activities. Her natural authority and gentle wisdom commanded respect from everyone in the household, including Richard himself. One evening, as Martha prepared the boys to leave, Richard approached her hesitantly. "They're remarkable children," he said. "You've raised them well, despite difficult circumstances." Martha regarded him steadily. "Children don't need wealth to thrive, Mr. Coleman. They need love, boundaries, and someone who believes in them." "I see that now," Richard admitted. "I've spent millions trying to help Olivia, but nothing has worked like this." He paused, struggling with unfamiliar humility. "Thank you." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." As their car pulled away, Richard stood in the doorway watching. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since Olivia's diagnosis, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into their new arrangement, Richard found himself sharing dinner with Martha in the mansion's smaller dining room. The children were in the sunroom with Olivia, their laughter drifting down the hallway. Richard swirled his wine thoughtfully, observing Martha across the table. There was something oddly familiar about her, a certain way she held herself, how she arranged her silverware with precision, her attentive gaze that seemed to notice everything. "You remind me of someone," he said abruptly. "Have we met before? Before the park, I mean." Martha carefully placed her fork down. "I wondered when you might ask that question." "So we have met?" She smoothed her napkin, choosing her words carefully. "Not exactly, but I knew your family well. I worked for your mother, Eleanor Coleman, for over 20 years. Richard nearly choked on his wine. "You worked for my mother? As what?" "I was the head housekeeper at the Coleman estate in Cambridge." Martha's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I managed the household staff from 1975 until 1995. Richard's mind raced through childhood memories, trying to place this woman in his past. 1995. That's when I was away at college. Why did you leave?" Martha hesitated. "I was dismissed, without references. For what reason?" "Your mother discovered that your brother Alex was spending time with my son Edward. They had become friends despite the differences in our family's positions." Martha's eyes held a hint of old pain. "Eleanor didn't think it appropriate for her son to associate with the housekeeper's boy." Richard sat back, stunned. "Alex never mentioned this. He wouldn't have. Your mother made it quite clear that the friendship was forbidden." Martha's voice remained neutral, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We were gone within the day." A terrible thought struck Richard. "Alexander," he whispered. Was he the father of—" "No," Martha interrupted firmly. "Edward was their father. My son." "What happened to him?" Richard asked, dreading the answer. "Edward never recovered from being uprooted so suddenly. He grew up angry, resentful." Martha's voice wavered slightly. "He married young. But when Hannah became pregnant with Tyler, he abandoned them. The pattern repeated with Lucas and Mason. He comes and goes from their lives, more ghost than father." Richard felt sick. "And Hannah?" "She's a good woman who's had a difficult life. She left the boys with me temporarily while she tries to establish herself in Providence. I've been raising them since Mason was born." The implications crashed over Richard like a wave. His family's actions had set in motion a chain of events spanning generations. The entitled cruelty of his mother had shaped not only his life, but the lives of these children who were now saving his daughter. "I nearly did the same thing," Richard whispered, horrified. "In the park, I was becoming my mother." Martha regarded him steadily. "Yes, you were." Richard pushed back from the table, walked to the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the estate gardens. "I remember Edward now," he said softly. Tall, quick to laugh. Alex adored him. They were like brothers, Martha confirmed. Until they weren't allowed to be. I'm sorry, Richard said, turning back to her. I can't undo what my family did to yours. No, you can't, Martha agreed. But you're at a crossroads, Richard Coleman. You can continue the cycle or you can break it. Richard thought of Olivia, of how close he'd come to destroying her chance at connection because of his prejudice and pride. He thought of his brother, Alex, dead 5 years now, never having reconciled with the friend who'd been torn away from him. I want to break it, he said finally, his voice firm with new resolve. I need to break it. For Olivia. For all of us. In the silence that followed, children's laughter floated in from the sunroom, a sound of pure joy that had been absent from the mansion for far too long. A sound that challenged decades of Coleman family tradition and offered the possibility of a different future. The revelation about Martha's connection to his family shook Richard to his core. That night he retreated to his study, unearthing old photo albums and family records he hadn't examined in years. In one dusty album, he found it. A summer picnic photo with a teenage Alexander laughing beside a tall boy with Martha's determined eyes. Edward. Sleep eluded him as memories resurfaced. How different might Edward's life have been if his mother hadn't interfered? How different might all their lives have been? When dawn broke, Richard emerged from his study a changed man. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It began with small gestures. He joined the children's morning session with Olivia instead of reviewing medical reports. He asked Martha about her techniques rather than consulting specialists. You have to get down on their level, Martha explained as Richard awkwardly lowered himself to the carpet where Olivia and Mason sat. Children don't communicate like adults. They speak through play, through touch, through presence. Richard felt ridiculous at first. A 48-year-old technology magnate sitting cross-legged on the floor, making nonsensical sounds with Tyler's encouragement. But when Olivia looked directly at him, truly saw him, for the first time in months, his embarrassment vanished. That's it, Mr. Coleman, Tyler exclaimed. She's connecting with you now. The corporate empire that had consumed Richard's life for decades suddenly seemed less important. He began delegating responsibilities, canceling unnecessary meetings, and rearranging his schedule to prioritize the afternoon sessions with Olivia and the boys. His executive team was baffled by the change. Richard Coleman, notorious for his 60-hour work weeks and ruthless business tactics, was now leaving the office by 3 each day and speaking of emotional intelligence and authentic connection. Sir, about the Singapore merger, his CFO ventured during one shortened meeting. What about it? Richard asked, checking his watch. We can drive a harder bargain. They're desperate to close, then offer fair terms. Richard interrupted. I want partners, not victims, and I need to be home by 3. The change extended beyond his business practices. Richard began acknowledging the mansion staff by name, inquiring about their families, noticing their contributions. Walter, who had served the family for decades, was particularly stunned when Richard insisted he join them for dinner one evening. You were right, Walter, Richard admitted over dessert. The answers did come from unexpected places. The most significant shift, however, was in Richard's approach to Olivia's care. The medical equipment was gradually moved to a side room. The rigorous therapy schedule gave way to a more balanced routine that incorporated play, rest, and natural interactions. Dr. Reynolds observed these changes with quiet approval. You're finally seeing your daughter, not just her condition, she noted during a follow-up visit. I was trying to fix her, Richard confessed, but she didn't need fixing. As Olivia began forming more sounds and responding to the communication system developed by Tyler, Richard found himself doubting every assumption he'd ever held. His wealth, his status, his power, none of it had helped his daughter. Instead, it had taken 3 children from the margins of society to show him what true connection looked like. One evening, as Richard watched Mason and Olivia drawing together, Martha joined him by the window. You're different, she observed. I'm trying to be, he replied. I spent years becoming exactly what my mother wanted, cold, efficient, successful. I never questioned it until now. It's never too late to change course, Martha said. Look at Olivia. A month ago she was unreachable. Now she's drawing pictures with Mason and learning Tyler's sound system. Because of your family, Richard acknowledged. The very people my mother would have kept at arm's length. Martha studied him thoughtfully. Perhaps that's the lesson in all this. The barriers we create, wealth, status, education, they don't protect us. They isolate us. Outside the window, snow continued to fall on the Boston evening, covering the manicured gardens in a blanket of white that made no distinction between expensive ornamental plants and common weeds. Inside, the laughter of children, all children, filled the once silent halls of the Coleman mansion. Richard Coleman, who had spent a lifetime building walls, now found himself tearing them down, one brick at a time. The peaceful rhythm that had developed at the Coleman mansion was shattered one crisp morning when Walter rushed into Richard's study, his usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. "Sir, there's a situation at the front gate. A woman is demanding to see the children she claims to be their mother." Richard felt his stomach drop. Hannah. In the entrance hall, Martha stood rigidly beside a younger woman with tired eyes and Tyler's determined jaw. Despite her worn clothing, Hannah carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Where are my children?" she demanded the moment Richard appeared. "They're upstairs with my daughter," Richard replied evenly. "Martha, perhaps you should—" "I'm not going anywhere," Martha said firmly. "Hannah, we need to discuss this calmly." "Calmly?" Hannah's voice rose. "My children have been coming to a stranger's mansion for weeks without my knowledge. I had to hear about it from a neighbor in Providence." Richard stepped forward. "It's Ms. Parker," she corrected sharply. "Ms. Parker, I understand your concern. Your children have been helping my daughter, who has a rare neurological condition. They've made remarkable progress with her." Hannah's expression didn't soften. "I don't care if they've been teaching her to fly. They're my children and nobody asked my permission." Before Richard could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the staircase. "Mom!" Tyler called out, launching himself into Hannah's arms. Lucas and Mason followed close behind, their faces lit with surprise and joy. The reunion momentarily diffused the tension as Hannah embraced her sons, checking them over with the careful eye of a mother who had seen too much hardship. "We've been helping the girl who can't talk," Mason explained excitedly. "She can say my name now." Hannah looked from her children to Richard, her expression conflicted. That's good, sweetheart. But we need to go home now." Panic flashed across the boys' faces. "But Mom," Tyler protested, "Olivia needs us. She's getting better." "I finally have a stable job and an apartment in Providence," Hannah explained, her voice softening. "I've come to take you home. For good this time." The implications hit everyone at once. Martha gripped the banister for support. Richard felt a cold dread settling in his chest. The children looked devastated. From upstairs came a high, distressed sound, Olivia sensing the disruption to her newfound stability. "She knows something's wrong," Lucas whispered. Richard made a split-second decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Instead of wielding his power and influence to control the situation, he chose honesty. "Ms. Parker," he said, "your children have become vital to my daughter's recovery. I can't pretend otherwise, but I also understand they belong with their mother." He took a deep breath. "Would you be willing to discuss a compromise?" Hannah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of compromise?" "My company has offices in Providence. We always need intelligent, capable people." He gestured toward the sitting room. "Perhaps we could discuss employment opportunities that would allow you to be with your children while they continue helping Olivia." Hannah hesitated, clearly torn between distrust of this wealthy stranger and the opportunity he represented. "I don't accept charity," she said firmly. "This isn't charity," Richard countered. Your children have a gift that no amount of money could buy. They've done more for Olivia than teams of specialists. I'm offering a fair exchange. Your expertise for theirs." Martha stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Hannah's arm. Please hear him out, dear. For the boys." Upstairs, Olivia's distress escalated. Mason slipped away from the group, climbing the stairs with determined focus. "I need to help her," he explained simply when his mother called after him. In that moment, watching her youngest son respond to another child's need with such instinctive compassion, Hannah's resistance began to soften. "Fine," she said finally. "We'll talk, but I make no promises." As they moved toward the sitting room, Richard caught a glimpse of Mason at the top of the stairs, leading a trembling Olivia by the hand. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, but her fingers were firmly entwined with Mason's, a connection that transcended words, wealth, and the complicated history of their families. The delicate new balance at the Coleman mansion was barely 3 weeks old when Richard received the call that sent his carefully reconstructed world into turmoil once more. "Richard? It's Miranda. I'm at Logan Airport." His ex-wife's voice, with its crisp British accent, sent a jolt through Richard's system. Miranda Coleman had walked away from their family 5 years ago, unable to cope with Olivia's diagnosis and Richard's obsessive approach to their daughter's care. She had returned to her native London, maintaining only the most perfunctory contact since. "Miranda," he managed, gripping the phone tightly. "Why are you here?" "Dr. Reynolds called me," she replied. "She said Olivia has made extraordinary progress. I needed to see for myself." Richard glanced toward the sunroom where Olivia sat with the 3 boys and Hannah, who had accepted a position managing community outreach for Coleman Technologies' Providence office. The family had moved into the guest cottage on the estate grounds 2 weeks earlier, an arrangement that benefited everyone involved. "Things are different now," Richard warned. "Very different." "So I've gathered," Miranda responded. "Will you send a car, or shall I take a taxi?" When Miranda arrived, her presence seemed to fill the mansion with a familiar tension. At 45, she remained striking, tall and slender, with Olivia's golden hair and delicate features. She moved through the entrance hall with the confidence of someone who had once claimed this space as her own. "You've changed things," she observed, noting the children's artwork now displayed alongside priceless paintings. "Yes," Richard acknowledged simply. Their reunion was awkward, loaded with unspoken accusations and regrets. But when Miranda first saw Olivia in the sunroom, surrounded by her new friends, the practiced composure she had maintained cracked visibly. "Oh my God," she whispered, watching her daughter laugh as Tyler performed an elaborate pantomime. "She's actually engaging." Richard stood beside his ex-wife, uncertain whether to feel proud of Olivia's progress or defensive about Miranda's 5-year absence. "Tyler, Lucas, and Mason have done what all our specialists couldn't," he said quietly. "They reached her." Miranda approached cautiously, kneeling at the edge of the children's circle. "Hello, Olivia," she said softly. "Do you remember me?" "It's Mummy." The room fell silent. Tyler, Lucas, and Mason watched with solemn curiosity. Hannah tensed, protective of both her children and Olivia, with whom she had formed her own bond. From the doorway, Martha observed the scene with wise, watchful eyes. Olivia studied Miranda's face for a long moment. Then, using the communication board Lucas had designed, she pointed deliberately, first to the image of a woman, then to a picture of a house, and finally to a question mark. "She's asking if you're staying," Lucas translated helpfully. The simple question carried the weight of years of abandonment. Miranda's composure broke completely as tears filled her eyes. "I don't know, darling," she answered honestly. "I'd like to for a while." Over dinner that evening, with the Parker family returned to their cottage, Richard and Miranda sat across from each other at the table where they had once presided as husband and wife. "Why did you leave?" Richard finally asked the question that had burned within him for 5 years. Miranda set down her fork, meeting his gaze directly. Because I couldn't bear what we were becoming. You were obsessed with fixing Olivia, with finding the perfect treatment, the perfect specialist. And she faltered. I was weak. I couldn't face a lifetime of watching our daughter struggle. I told myself she had you, that you would move mountains for her. I tried, Richard admitted. I failed spectacularly until 3 homeless children showed me what Olivia really needed. Miranda studied him with new eyes. You've changed. I had to, he replied simply. And now? She asked. Where do we go from here? It was a complicated question, with no easy answer. Miranda's return added yet another layer of complexity to the already unconventional household. Her presence both unsettled and completed something in their daughter's life, a missing piece restored, however tentatively. As the days passed, Miranda observed the dynamics that had developed in her absence. She watched Hannah's growing confidence as she balanced motherhood with her new professional role. She noted Martha's quiet authority that somehow held their disparate family together, and she witnessed the remarkable bond between Olivia and the 3 boys who had broken through her isolation. It's extraordinary, Miranda confided to Richard one evening as they watched the children from the terrace. This hodgepodge family you've created, it's nothing like what we planned, but it works. Richard nodded. I've learned that sometimes. The best families aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones we find. The days following Miranda's return brought a complex tapestry of emotions to the Coleman mansion. What might have become a bitter contest for Olivia's affection instead evolved into something unexpected, a tentative alliance between 2 women who had navigated very different kinds of pain. I left because I couldn't face it, Miranda confessed to Hannah one afternoon as they watched the children in the garden. What kind of mother does that make me? Hannah considered this, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. Parenthood breaks us all in different ways, she said finally. I've made my share of mistakes too. This simple acknowledgement, the shared humanity beneath their vastly different circumstances, formed the foundation of an unlikely friendship. Miranda, with her polished London sophistication, and Hannah, with her hard-earned resilience, found common ground in their love for their children and their desire to heal fractured families. Miranda decided to rent a small house near the estate, allowing her to be present in Olivia's life while maintaining healthy boundaries with Richard. Their marriage was beyond repair, both acknowledged, but they could forge a new kind of partnership focused entirely on their daughter's well-being. I'm thinking of staying in Boston permanently, Miranda told Richard as they reviewed Olivia's progress with Dr. Reynolds. I've missed too much already. Richard nodded, surprised by the lack of resentment he felt. Olivia would like that. We all would. Meanwhile, Hannah flourished in her new position. Years of managing crises with limited resources had honed her problem-solving skills and empathy, qualities that made her exceptionally effective at community outreach. Coleman Technology's reputation began to shift in Providence, from distant corporate entity to engaged community partner. You have a natural talent for this work, Richard observed during a review of her first community initiative, a technology access program for underserved neighborhoods. Poverty teaches you to see what people actually need, not what others think they should have, Hannah replied. Martha remained the steady center of this evolving constellation. Guiding both families with quiet wisdom, she moved between the mansion and the guest cottage with ease, maintaining traditions while embracing necessary changes. Her decades of experience managing a household served her well as she helped balance the complex dynamics of their blended family. The children adapted with remarkable resilience. Tyler, Lucas, and Mason treated the estate grounds as an extension of their playground, equally comfortable in the guest cottage with Hannah and in the mansion with Olivia. They accepted Miranda's presence with the straightforward curiosity of children, incorporating her into their games and communication systems without question. Olivia herself continued to progress, adding new sounds and gestures to her repertoire weekly. The communication board Lucas had created expanded to include dozens of concepts. She began to express preferences, emotions, and even simple jokes. One evening, As the extended family gathered for dinner, a new weekly tradition, Olivia carefully arranged her communication cards on the table. Everyone waited patiently as she selected and arranged them in sequence. Happy, family, here. The simple statement brought tears to more than one pair of eyes around the table. Martha reached over to squeeze Olivia's hand. Yes, dear, family is here. Later that night, Richard stood at his study window, watching the lights in the guest cottage where Hannah was likely helping the boys with their schoolwork. In the garden apartment, Miranda would be settling in with her evening tea. Here in the mansion, Martha was reading a bedtime story to Olivia. Family. The word had once meant something specific to Richard, a proper lineage, a respectable bloodline, a reflection of status and achievement. Eleanor Coleman's definition, which he had absorbed without question. Now it meant something entirely different, something messier, more complicated, and infinitely more valuable. A collection of people who had found each other against all odds, whose differences complemented rather than divided them. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Walter. Sir, I thought you might want to know. Miss Olivia asked for her mother before bed tonight. Both of them. Richard raised an eyebrow. Both? Yes, sir. She pointed to Mrs. Miranda on her board and then to Ms. Hannah. She seemed quite insistent that they both come to say goodnight. Richard smiled, imagining the scene, his proper British ex-wife and the resilient young mother from Providence, both sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, united in their care for a child who had discovered that love was not limited to conventional boundaries. Thank you, Walter, he said softly, for everything. An unexpected email arrived in Richard's inbox on a Tuesday morning. The sender's name, Dr. Heinrich Vogel, Director, Neurocognitive Research Institute, Zurich, meant nothing to him at first, but the subject line made his heart race. Revolutionary treatment possibility for Olivia Coleman. Richard hesitated before opening it, his finger hovering over the mouse. 6 months ago, he would have clicked immediately, desperate for any medical solution. Now he found himself strangely reluctant. The email was detailed and professional. Dr. Vogel had heard about Olivia's case through medical channels, perhaps from one of the many specialists Richard had consulted over the years. The Zurich Institute had developed a groundbreaking neurosurgical procedure that showed extraordinary promise for children with conditions similar to Olivia's. Early trial results indicate a 78% success rate in restoring normal speech patterns, the email stated. We believe Olivia would be an ideal candidate. Richard read the email 3 times before calling Dr. Reynolds. I've heard of Vogel's work, she confirmed after reviewing the information. It's cutting-edge neurostimulation combined with targeted regenerative therapy, theoretically sound but still experimental. And the risks? Richard asked, a question he might not have bothered with months earlier. Significant, Dr. Reynolds replied honestly. Any brain surgery carries risks, and with experimental procedures, there are always unknown factors. Richard thanked her and sat in silence after ending the call. He found himself thinking not about medical statistics but about Olivia's face that morning. As she worked with Tyler on new sounds, her concentration and determination evident in every attempt. That evening, he shared the email with Miranda during their now regular co-parenting discussion. Surgery? Miranda's face paled. In Switzerland? The success rates look promising, Richard said, though with less enthusiasm than he might once have shown. It could potentially restore her speech completely. Miranda studied him with curiosity. 6 months ago, you would have had her on a plane already. What's changed? The question gave Richard pause. Everything, he finally admitted. I'm not sure fixing her speech is the goal anymore. She's communicating now in her own way with help from the boys, but if she could speak normally. Miranda left the sentence unfinished. Would she be happier? More herself? Richard shook his head. I don't know anymore. They agreed to discuss it with Martha and Hannah, whose perspectives had become invaluable. The conversation expanded to include Dr. Reynolds and Olivia's therapy team. Opinions were divided, with the medical professionals generally favoring the opportunity while Martha expressed caution. "She's making steady progress with the methods we're using now," Martha pointed out. "Is it worth the risk of surgery?" 2. Richard's surprised Tyler asked to join the discussion after overhearing the adults talking. "Are you trying to make Olivia talk like everyone else?" the 9-year-old asked directly. Richard nodded. "There's a doctor who might be able to help her speak normally." Tyler considered this with remarkable seriousness for his age. "But what if she doesn't want to talk like everyone else? What if she likes her special language?" "Don't know what she wants," Miranda said gently. "Did you ask her?" Tyler challenged. The adults exchanged guilty glances. They hadn't. Using the expanded communication system that had been developed over the past months, they carefully explained the situation to Olivia. She listened intently, her eyes moving between the adults as they spoke. When asked if she wanted to try the new treatment, Olivia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward Mason, who had been quietly observing from the corner. The 5-year-old came to sit beside her, taking her hand in his familiar gesture of support. Finally, Olivia pointed to several images on her board in sequence. Scared, doctor, cut, head, then, more hopefully, friends, help, me, talk, already. The simplicity and clarity of her response struck Richard deeply. His daughter understood more than any of them had given her credit for. She recognized both the opportunity and the risk, and she had made her choice based not on medical possibilities, but on human connection. Later that evening, as Richard drafted a polite but firm refusal to Dr. Vogel, he reflected on how completely his values had transformed. 6 months ago, he would have pursued any medical solution regardless of risk in his desperate quest to make Olivia normal. Now he understood that normal was a meaningless standard, and that his daughter's happiness and sense of security were the only metrics that truly mattered. When Dr. Vogel responded with an insistent follow-up, "This may be her only opportunity for a normal life," Richard's reply was brief but resolute. "My daughter is already living an extraordinary life, surrounded by people who love and understand her exactly as she is. We respectfully decline." The invitation to meet with the Swiss medical team arrived by courier, formal, impressive, and impossible to ignore. Dr. Heinrich Vogel and his associates would be in Boston for a medical conference and requested a personal consultation regarding Olivia. Richard shared the invitation with Miranda during their weekly co-parenting coffee. "They're persistent," Miranda observed, studying the embossed letterhead. "I suppose that's a good quality in surgeons." "They believe in their work," Richard replied, "as I once believed in every new treatment that came along." The meeting was scheduled in a private conference room at Massachusetts General Hospital. Richard arrived with Miranda, Dr. Reynolds, and, at his insistence, Martha. The Swiss team consisted of Dr. Vogel, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, alongside 2 younger colleagues whose credentials were equally impressive. "Mr. and Mrs. Coleman," Dr. Vogel greeted them formally. "Thank you for meeting with us. We've reviewed Olivia's complete medical history, and we are more convinced than ever that she is an ideal candidate for our procedure." What followed was a detailed presentation, brain scans, neurological pathways, success rates from preliminary trials. The science was compelling, the delivery impeccable. Richard listened attentively, asking precise questions about methodology and outcomes. "The procedure involves targeted neurostimulation of the speech centers," Dr. Vogel explained, indicating areas on a digital brain model. "Combined with our proprietary regenerative therapy, we've seen remarkable results in restoring normal speech patterns." "And the risks?" Martha asked directly. Dr. Vogel's smile tightened slightly. "All surgical procedures carry some risk, of course, but our technique is minimally invasive, and the potential benefits far outweigh." "Specifically," Richard interrupted, "what are the risks?" The younger neurologist stepped forward. "There's a small chance of infection, as with any surgery. More relevant to your concerns would be the 4% risk of affecting other cognitive functions during the procedure. In rare cases, less than 2%, patients have experienced alteration in personality or emotional regulation. A heavy silence followed this admission. Alteration in personality, Miranda repeated slowly. Extremely rare, Dr. Vogel assured them, and must be weighed against the enormous benefit of normal speech capabilities. Think of how Olivia's life would change: college, career, independence. Richard glanced at Martha, whose expression remained carefully neutral. 6 months ago, these words would have been exactly what he wanted to hear. The promise of normalcy for his daughter would have overshadowed any risk. Mr. Coleman, Dr. Vogel continued, clearly sensing hesitation, this may be Olivia's only opportunity for a normal life. Our research funding is limited and we can only accept a small number of candidates. If you decline, we'll need to move to the next family on our list. Richard stood up suddenly, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital gardens. Below, patients in wheelchairs were enjoying the spring sunshine, some accompanied by visitors, others by therapy dogs. Dr. Vogel, he said finally, turning back to the room, I appreciate your team coming all this way, but we must decline your offer. The Swiss doctor blinked in surprise. Mr. Coleman, perhaps you don't fully understand the opportunity. I understand perfectly, Richard interrupted with unexpected gentleness. 6 months ago, I would have signed whatever consent forms you put in front of me. I would have paid any amount, taken any risk if it meant making my daughter normal. He moved back to the table, his decision becoming firmer with every word. Olivia is progressing remarkably with her current support system. She's communicating effectively through multiple channels, sign language, picture boards, and a growing vocabulary of sounds. More importantly, she's happy. But she could have a normal life, Dr. Vogel insisted. Who defines what's normal? Richard asked, the question genuine rather than confrontational. My daughter has a family that loves her unconditionally. She's learning to communicate in ways that work for her. She has meaningful connections with other children. By any measure that truly matters, her life is already extraordinary. Dr. Reynolds nodded in quiet approval. Martha reached over to squeeze Richard's hand briefly. Miranda's eyes shone with unexpected tears. Medicine should serve people as they are, Richard continued, not attempt to remake them into some arbitrary standard of normalcy. I've learned that lesson the hard way. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Dr. Vogel made one final attempt. You're making an emotional decision rather than a logical one. Richard smiled. Yes, he agreed simply, and that's the greatest progress I've made as Olivia's father. Outside the hospital, Martha linked her arm through Richard's as they walked toward the waiting car. Eleanor Coleman's son would never have made that decision, she observed quietly. No, Richard agreed. He wouldn't have. The definitive rejection of the Swiss procedure marked more than a medical decision. It represented Richard's complete break from the values that had shaped his life for decades. The obsession with appearances, status, and conformity that he had inherited from his mother had finally lost its grip on him. In its place was something far less glamorous but infinitely more valuable: the wisdom to accept his daughter exactly as she was, and the courage to defend her right to be herself, in a world that too often demanded conformity. 1 year later, the Coleman mansion stood transformed. The sterile medical wing had been converted into a vibrant, inclusive school for children with diverse communication needs. Where cold medical equipment once dominated, colorful learning stations and adaptive technology now filled the space. The gardens, once manicured to perfection, now featured accessible playground equipment and sensory paths designed with input from the children themselves. In the main hall, a celebration was underway. The first end-of-year presentation of the Coleman Communication Academy was about to begin, and families filled the seats, some wealthy, others from modest backgrounds, all united by their connection to children who communicated differently. Richard stood near the back, watching with quiet pride. His corporate responsibilities had been dramatically reduced over the past year, with trusted executives handling daily operations while he focused on the school. The technology titan who once measured success in profit margins and market share now found fulfillment in the small victories of children finding their voices in whatever form those voices took. Hannah moved confidently through the crowd, greeting parents and directing volunteers. As director of the Coleman Foundation for Assistive Communication, she had channeled her natural leadership abilities into developing technologies based on the intuitive methods created by her sons. Her work had already helped dozens of families. Beyond their immediate circle, Martha supervised the residential program that provided housing for families who couldn't otherwise access the specialized education offered at the academy. Her decades of experience running the Coleman household had prepared her perfectly for creating a warm, supportive environment for children from diverse backgrounds. Miranda divided her time between London and Boston, maintaining her career while remaining actively involved in Olivia's life. The co-parenting relationship she and Richard had developed served as a model for other families at the school, demonstrating that separation didn't have to mean division. As the lights dimmed, Walter, now the school's transportation coordinator, guided the last few guests to their seats. The audience fell silent as the first group of students took the stage for their presentation. Richard felt a familiar tightening in his throat as Olivia stepped forward, flanked by Tyler, Lucas, and Mason. At 8 years old, she stood tall and confident, a stark contrast to the withdrawn child she had been just a year earlier. Tyler, now 10, remained her steadfast communication partner. Lucas, 8, continued to devise creative tools to bridge communication gaps. Mason, 6, still held her hand with the same simple, powerful connection that had first broken through her isolation. Using a combination of signs, picture cards, and spoken words, the 4 children presented their year-end project, a story about friendship that transcended barriers. When it came time for Olivia's part, the audience held its collective breath. With clear effort but unmistakable determination, she formed the words that had once seemed impossible. "Thank you, Tyler, Lucas, Mason. You gave me a voice." The simplicity and profound truth of her statement brought tears to eyes throughout the audience. Martha clasped her hands in quiet joy. Hannah beamed with motherly pride. Miranda wiped away tears. And Richard, the man who had once believed that money and power could solve any problem, understood at last the true meaning of wealth. After the presentation, as families mingled and celebrated, Richard found himself standing in the garden with Martha, watching the children play on the equipment that had replaced his mother's prized rose bushes. Eleanor would be horrified, he observed with a small smile. "Perhaps," Martha agreed. "Or perhaps she would have learned as you did." Richard shook his head. "Some people never change." "You did," Martha reminded him gently. The journey from that fateful day in Boston Common to this moment had transformed not just a mansion, but an entire worldview. Where Richard had once seen deficiency in his daughter's difference, he now recognized the unique gifts she brought to their lives. Where he had once valued status and conformity, he now cherished authenticity and connection. As the evening concluded, the expanded Coleman family, Richard and Miranda, Hannah and her boys, Martha, and many others who had joined their unconventional circle, gathered for a group photograph on the mansion steps. "Everyone say, 'family,'" called the photographer. The word echoed across the gathering, some speaking clearly, others signing, some using communication devices, others making unique sounds that meant the same thing: family, connection, belonging, and Olivia's voice, in its own perfect hard-won form, joined the chorus.